Frank Sinatra was about 45 minutes into his set at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas when everything stopped. He was in the middle of a song, the room holding its breath, 2,000 people completely absorbed, when his manager suddenly stepped onto the stage. That never happened. Frank caught one look at his face and knew something was terribly wrong. He stopped singing. The band faltered, then fell silent. A confused hush spread through the showroom. The manager leaned in close and whispered 4 words that seemed to knock the air out of the room. "The president is dead." Frank Sinatra froze beneath the spotlight. The color drained from his face. His hand tightened around the microphone stand, steadying himself so he wouldn't collapse. And in the next 60 seconds, the choice he made would become one of the most unforgettable moments in entertainment history. It was November 22, 1963, the day America changed forever. President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas, Texas, at 12:30 p.m. Central Time. The news ripped across the country almost instantly. Television broadcasts were cut mid-program. Radio stations stopped their music. Offices emptied. Streets fell quiet. A nation collectively stopped moving. But in Las Vegas, life had continued, at least for a while. When the shots were fired in Dallas, Frank Sinatra was still getting ready for his show. The time difference mattered. By the time he walked onto the Sands stage at 7:15 p.m. Pacific Time, the entire country already knew what had happened. Everyone, that is, except Frank. Frank's manager, Hank Santacola, had been trying to reach Frank before the show started. But Frank had a routine. He isolated himself before performances. No interruptions, no phone calls, just focus and preparation. So when the news broke, Hank couldn't get to Frank in time. He made a decision. Let Frank start the show. Tell him after the first few songs. Maybe by then there would be more information. Maybe it would turn out to be less catastrophic than initial reports suggested. It was a terrible decision, born from impossible circumstances. Frank walked on stage that night with no idea the world had changed. He was in a good mood. The audience was energetic. He opened with his usual charm and charisma. The first few songs went perfectly. Frank was in his element, owning the stage like only he could. The audience was loving it. And then Hank walked onto the stage. Frank saw him immediately. In 30 years of performing, Hank had never interrupted a show. Never. Frank's smile disappeared. He stopped singing mid-verse. The band, confused, kept playing for a few more bars before stopping. Frank turned to Hank, his face showing concern. The audience could see something was wrong, but didn't know what. Hank leaned in close to Frank's ear. The showroom was so quiet that you could hear people breathing. Hank whispered, "Frank, President Kennedy has been shot. He's dead. I'm so sorry." Frank's reaction was visible to everyone. His face went white. His eyes went wide with shock. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hand on the microphone stand tightened so hard his knuckles went white. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds, Frank Sinatra stood there, trying to process the impossible. The audience still didn't know what was happening. They were watching Frank Sinatra have some kind of crisis on stage. Some people thought maybe he was sick. Others thought it was part of the act. But the people in the front rows could see Frank's face, could see real devastation there, real shock. This wasn't performance. This was genuine human reaction to tragedy. Frank turned slowly to face the audience. His voice, when he spoke, was rough and broken. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed that President Kennedy has been assassinated in Dallas." The showroom erupted in gasps and cries. Women started crying immediately. Men sat in stunned silence. The news had been spreading through Vegas, but many people in the audience had been at the show and hadn't heard yet. Frank had just delivered the worst news of their lives. Frank stood there, tears starting to stream down his face. He wasn't trying to hide them. He wasn't trying to maintain composure. He was grieving in real time in front of 2,000 people. "I can't," Frank started to say. "I can't continue this show. I'm sorry. The president. He was my friend." Frank's voice broke completely. He bent over slightly, his free hand going to his face. The audience was crying with him. This wasn't Frank Sinatra, the performer, anymore. This was Frank Sinatra, the man, broken by the death of someone he cared about. Hank moved to lead Frank off stage. The show was clearly over. But Frank straightened up. He wiped his face with his hand. He looked out at the audience, all of them crying, all of them shocked, all of them lost. And Frank made a decision. "No," Frank said to Hank. "No, I'm not walking off this stage." Frank turned back to the microphone. His voice was steadier now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've all just received terrible news. The worst news. Our president, our leader, a good man, has been taken from us. And I don't know what to do. I don't know how to process this. But I know President Kennedy loved music. He loved this country. And he'd want us to honor him." Frank turned to the band. "Do you all know what happened?" The band members nodded. Several were crying. Frank took a deep breath. "Then let's honor him, the only way we know how." Frank nodded to the conductor. "Let's do it." The conductor, understanding immediately what Frank was asking for, raised his baton. The band began to play a song that everyone in America knew. A song about hope and dreams and better days. Frank began to sing, his voice cracking with emotion, tears still streaming down his face. The performance was unlike anything anyone had ever witnessed. Frank wasn't performing. He was grieving through music. Every note carried the weight of his pain. Every word was a prayer. The audience sat transfixed, many of them openly weeping. This wasn't entertainment. This was collective mourning. This was a nation processing tragedy together. When Frank finished the song, the showroom was silent. No applause, just the sound of 2,000 people crying together. Frank stood at the microphone, tears running down his face, making no effort to hide them. "President Kennedy," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "God rest his soul. May God comfort his family. May God help us all understand why." Frank looked out at the audience. "I can't do any more tonight. I'm sorry. But thank you for sharing this moment with me. Go home, hold your loved ones, and pray for America." Frank set down the microphone and walked off stage. The audience sat in silence for several minutes. Then, slowly, people began to leave. No one was talking. Everyone was crying. What they just witnessed wasn't a performance. It was one of the most honest, vulnerable moments in entertainment history. Backstage, Frank collapsed into a chair. Dean Martin, who'd been watching from the wings, sat with him. Frank was sobbing. "Dean, he's dead. Jack is dead. How is that possible?" Dean had no answer. He just sat with his friend, while Frank cried. Over the next few hours, more details came out. The shooter, the chaos in Dallas, Jackie Kennedy covered in blood, the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson. Frank stayed in his dressing room, watching the news coverage, unable to process what had happened. To understand Frank's reaction, you need to understand his relationship with John F. Kennedy. They'd met in the 1950s when Kennedy was a senator. Frank had been immediately impressed by Kennedy's charisma, his intelligence, his vision for America. When Kennedy ran for president in 1960, Frank became one of his most visible supporters. Frank organized fundraisers. He performed at rallies. He used his fame to help Kennedy reach voters. And when Kennedy won, Frank felt like he'd been part of something historic. The inauguration in January 1961 was one of the proudest moments of Frank's life. He'd produced and performed at the inaugural gala. He'd stood on that stage and celebrated what felt like a new era for America. Camelot. The Kennedy White House represented youth, energy, hope, and Frank felt connected to it. He felt like his friend was leading the country into a better future. But the relationship between Frank and JFK was complicated. After the inauguration, the Kennedy administration had distanced themselves from Frank. There were concerns about Frank's connections to organized crime. The FBI had files on Frank, and the Kennedys, particularly Bobby Kennedy, decided that association with Frank Sinatra was politically dangerous. Frank had been devastated by that rejection. He'd built a compound in Palm Springs specifically to host President Kennedy. He'd had a helicopter pad constructed. He'd prepared everything for a presidential visit. And then the Kennedys had canceled. They'd stayed with Bing Crosby instead. Frank had felt betrayed and humiliated. His friendship with JFK had cooled significantly. They'd remained cordial, but distant. Frank had felt used and discarded. But despite that complicated history, Frank had still cared deeply about Kennedy. He'd still believed in what Kennedy represented. And when Bobby Kennedy had reached out to Frank in 1963, trying to mend fences, Frank had been receptive. There had been talk of Frank performing at future Kennedy campaign events. The relationship was healing. And now, Kennedy was dead. And Frank would never get the chance to fully reconcile. The next few days were a blur for Frank. He watched the funeral on television like the rest of America. He saw Jackie Kennedy in her black veil. He saw John Jr. saluting his father's casket. He cried through all of it. Frank wanted to attend the funeral. He felt like he should be there. But he also knew his presence might be unwelcome. The Kennedys had pushed him away for good reason. So Frank stayed in Palm Springs and mourned privately. But Jackie Kennedy sent Frank a message through mutual friends. She remembered Frank's support during the campaign. She remembered his genuine affection for her husband. And she wanted Frank to know that the president had always appreciated him, even when political realities required distance. That message meant everything to Frank. It gave him some peace, some sense that his friendship with Kennedy, complicated as it was, had been real. Frank never performed that song the same way again. The one he'd sung that night at the Sands after learning of Kennedy's death. For the rest of his career, whenever Frank sang it, you could hear the weight of that night. Musicians who played with Frank said he'd get a distant look in his eyes. He'd be back in that moment, grieving for his friend, grieving for America's lost innocence. The assassination changed Frank profoundly. He'd always been politically engaged, but after Kennedy's death, Frank became more cynical. The idealism that Kennedy had represented died in Dallas. Frank had believed in Camelot. He'd believed that one man could change the country, could make it better. And then that man had been shot in the street. It shattered something in Frank, made him question what power and fame really meant, made him understand how fragile everything was. In the years after the assassination, Frank became close with the Kennedy family in ways he hadn't been before. He supported Bobby Kennedy's political career. He was devastated again when Bobby was assassinated in 1968. Frank performed at fundraisers for Kennedy causes. He helped Jackie when she needed support. The distance that had existed during JFK's presidency dissolved in the shared grief after his death. Frank rarely talked publicly about that night at the Sands, but in private, friends said it haunted him. The memory of standing on stage, learning his friend was dead, having to decide whether to continue or stop. The memory of singing through tears while 2,000 people grieved with him. It was one of the rawest, most honest moments of Frank's entire career. No performance, no cool facade, just human pain shared with strangers. Dean Martin later said, "That night at the Sands, I saw Frank at his most vulnerable and his most courageous. He could have walked off that stage. Nobody would have blamed him. But he stayed. He sang. He gave that audience something to hold on to in the worst moment of their lives. That's what great artists do. They show up even when it hurts. Years later, in the 1980s, Frank was asked in an interview about Kennedy's assassination, where he was when he heard, what he remembered. Frank's answer was brief but powerful. I was on stage, I was singing, and suddenly the world stopped making sense. I finished that show for Jack, because he loved music, because he loved this country, and because I couldn't think of anything else to do with my grief except sing. The interviewer asked if he had any regrets about his relationship with Kennedy. Frank was quiet for a long moment. I regret that we didn't have more time. I regret that politics got in the way of friendship. I regret that I never got to tell him how much his vision for America meant to me. But most of all, I regret that we lost him. Not just me personally, but all of us. He was taking us somewhere better. And then he was gone. November 22nd, 1963 was the day America's innocence died. The day hope was assassinated along with a president. And Frank Sinatra, standing on a stage in Las Vegas, processing that tragedy in real time, showed the country how to grieve. Not by hiding, not by pretending to be strong, but by being honest about the pain, by sharing the grief, by using music to express what words couldn't. The footage of Frank's performance that night doesn't exist. No one was recording. But the people who were there never forgot it. For the rest of their lives, they told the story of the night Frank Sinatra learned the president was dead and chose to honor him with music. The night Frank Sinatra cried on stage and gave 2,000 people permission to cry with him. The night entertainment became something more than entertainment. It became communion in grief. Frank Sinatra lived for another 35 years after Kennedy's assassination. He had many more triumphs, many more performances. But people who knew him well said a piece of Frank died that day in Dallas, along with the president. The piece that believed in American idealism. The piece that thought fame and power could protect the things that mattered. The piece that believed tomorrow would always be better than today. When Frank Sinatra died in 1998, among his personal possessions was a photograph from the 1961 inauguration. Frank on stage, performing for the newly sworn-in President Kennedy. Frank looked young in the photo, hopeful, like he believed he was part of something that would change the world. On the back of the photograph, Frank had written a date, November 22nd, 1963, and below that, 2 words, never forget. Frank never forgot. He carried Kennedy's death with him for the rest of his life. And that night at the Sands, when he learned his friend was gone and chose to sing through his tears, Frank Sinatra showed America what leadership looks like in tragedy. Not perfect composure, not pretending to be unaffected, but honest grief, shared pain, and the belief that even in the darkest moments, music can bring us together. That's the legacy of November 22nd, 1963 for Frank Sinatra. Not just the death of a president, not just the loss of a friend, but the moment when Frank learned that some griefs are too big to carry alone, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand in front of people and let them see you break. Because in your breaking, they find permission to break too. And in breaking together, maybe, somehow, we all start to heal.